So hello, everybody. Welcome to our program. And today we're going to have a very interesting conversation because we didn't touch this topic before. That's why I think that for our audience it will be somehow new, but something new, but still very interesting, especially for this period of time. So my guest today is Dr. Kenneth Dekleva. Is a practicing psychiatrist and former U.S. government physician diplomat in Moscow. He is now a senior fellow of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations. That's correct. Hi.
Thank you for having me, Ksenia. I'm really honored and pleased to be on your show.
Thank you for your time. So I want to start our conversation with a very, I'd say, interesting topic for me, because from what I observe from different series, especially on Netflix, about serial killers, about human behavior researchers, and I also hear that it's quite easy to deceive a lie detector. So in my point of view, it's quite easy to deceive even some experts and people around you if you know some basic of how to do it. So my question is for you as an expert, is it really easy to deceive for many years the environments of top officials or top politicians, and especially the environments of diplomatic services that allow you to talk with them as a normal person, and for years those people do not see any troubles in your minds or psychic? Is it easy?
It's not easy, but for someone like President Putin, with his lifelong training as a KGB officer, it's easy. And he's a master of deception and disinformation. He's been doing it his whole life, and he's very, very good at it. As we would say, he certainly at times has pulled the wool over Western politicians' eyes. And it's very easy, even for highly experienced and intelligent diplomats, politicians, to be fooled, if you will, by President Putin's words and his behavior. But I think now, given what has happened since the beginning of this horrible, tragic, genocidal war in February of 2022 against Ukraine, I think there's more unanimity, at least in the West, as I understand it, as to President Putin's core kind of psychology and character. I think the fact that he's a ruthless leader is by now well understood. If you look at his pattern of behavior, for example, in the early 2000s in Grozny, in 2008 against Georgia, in 2014 when this war really actually started in Ukraine with the attacks in the Donbass and Crimea, an attack against a sovereign nation, and 2015 to 2018 in Syria, if you look at the role of Russia in Syria and Aleppo, and the assassinations of Litvinenko with a nuclear weapon, polonium-210, in London in 2006, the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal in Britain in 2018 with Novichok, the killing of Boris Nemtsov in 2018, the attempted assassination of Alexei Navalny in 2020, and then, of course, the horrors that we've seen during this war, which have led to President Putin's indictment by the Hague Tribunal as a war criminal. So I think that part of Putin is by now well understood. I think where many leaders and politicians, diplomats, and even intelligence officials in the West continue to get President Putin wrong is they underestimate his resilience. And they also underestimate his kind of cold, cruel rationality. And we can talk more about that, because I think a lot of people have trouble with the concept. How could someone be rational who makes a horrible, from his point of view, a strategic intelligence failure to invade Ukraine, a country that is a real country and that has fought back courageously and heroically? President Putin, like many of us in the West, underestimated the courage, the heroism, and the character of President Zelensky of Ukraine.
We sure will talk about his psychic portrait a little bit later, but I want to stress on the thoughts of different politicians years before. For example, I remember in the book called Democracy, written by Condoleezza Rice, and she wrote there the portrait of Putin long before then he showed himself as a real dictator. And even in this small personality who wasn't president at that times, but visited White House, she saw very uneasy personality. I mean, she was writing and stressing that he's not as simple as it seems to be. And I remember Angela Merkel was frightened by the dogs, and maybe in his office. And maybe some would say that this is the type of his special characteristic of behavior, but no one saw the psychic pathologies in his behavior. And it's interesting for me why.
I can't answer that, but I think in my writings and in my writing, speeches, and podcasts for the last 7 years, I've written extensively about President Putin and said we have to try to understand his leadership psychology, his style, which is how he sees himself through his eyes, how others around him, both his inner circle and the Russian people, see him, and how other leaders that have interacted with him see him. I think it's true that if you look at President Putin in the early 2000s, when he traveled, for example, all over Western Europe, was feted as a world leader, met with the Queen, other leaders of France, Germany. He had good relationships. He met with President Bush in the United States in Crawford. And President Bush said he looked into his eyes and saw his soul, the famous quote. And I think the British, certainly in the Europeans, thought of him, to borrow a phrase from the late Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, that this was someone we could do business with. And those were strategic political choices that were made that in hindsight certainly look wrong. I think we have to borrow from President Putin's own language about his own psychology, where he says, I value in his book First Person, which I encourage your listeners and readers to read if they haven't, Первое лицо in Russian. He said, I'm a specialist in human relations. And I agree with that. He understands people, and he's had a lot of sophistication as a politician on how to manipulate and deal with people. And he's still doing that to this very day. He hasn't changed or stopped. In this sense, a leopard doesn't grow new spots. So we're seeing the same Putin all along. But what's striking is the remarkable change between, if you contrast two speeches, his famous speech in 2000, I believe it was 2001, to the Bundestag in perfect German, where he spoke for 10 minutes about how Russia's a part of Europe, and he got a standing ovation. And you contrast that with the fateful speech that began the war in February 2022, what Putin calls a special military operation. The contrast between the content and the tone of those two speeches is stark. It couldn't be more stark. So I think we still, in some sense, misunderstand, and some people continue to get President Putin wrong, and he still continues to show the ability to surprise us. The other example I'll bring up, which we can talk about more if you wish, is his reaction to the mutiny by Prigozhin in June, and the way he handled that. It was quite interesting.